one thing I love about Robin is the clarity of thought and the amount of thought that goes into his points. So you might not agree with his points, but if you want to argue against him, you're going to have to come up with a very good argument. And I'm also glad that he's been so outspoken with his harmful material warnings. I almost thought maybe we should have called this Robin Unleashed, and we might have got some more people here as well. I also just want to acknowledge Honourable Bernardo Swatboy, leader of the Landless People's Movement, who came in as well, so thank you for coming. We want to open it up for debate now. I think also we have an audience online because this is being streamed on Facebook as well, so we do welcome our online audience as well. So maybe you can raise your points on the Facebook page, and we'll see if we can include some of them as well. But, so I think we move to the question and answer discussion phase now. We have a bit of time. I'll probably try to take 3 or 4 points or questions, and then we'll ask Robin to respond. So,
I'm here from your money, entrepreneur. My question deals with the issue of globalization versus democratization in the third world countries such as Namibia. We have spoken about the policies for the global interest and how governments can create a conducive environment for foreign investors. But how does that benefit the people at the grassroots level? Isn't that, has that not been the case since many African countries have gained independence? They've been told, liberalize your economy so that your people at the grassroots levels can benefit from the economy. But we have seen that the so-called trickle-down economics doesn't actually get to work. In essence, the professor seated next to me would usually say, you're trying to make Namibia without making Namibians great. Isn't this what you're trying to do? We create a conducive environment for these multinational corporations. They come here and they take our capital without really benefiting the local people at the grassroots level. What do you say about that?
My name is Alexi Mahut, business owner, and I'm the president of the Black Business Leadership Network of Namibia. Now, generally, Namibia is a very skilled economy. There is a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And if you look at the findings of the World Bank, where they say that close to 1.5 million people are disadvantaged in the black community. What are your viewpoints on that? How do we address this in looking at mitigating factors? Because as long as the economy is in the way it is, and all of this is due to past colonial sort of organizations that has caused all of this. How do we address this and how do we get past this so that we are all equal and the economy, is benefiting, all of us? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. I think you are a real diplomat and very elegant. You avoided the difficult thing, and that's the middle road. So I would like to hear what's the middle road. It's never the one or the other extreme. It's about the grey areas. But what are the probabilities linked to the high and the low road, if you don't want to talk about the middle road? And then, do you have any figures in terms of disposable private income? I think that's very important because that is the money that we have in our pocket. That's even more important, could be more important than even government debt. And how do you have comparative figures of that to demonstrate or illustrate? Then the other point is, what do you think is the, I know you're not a politician, but what do you think is the political maturity in this country in order to change the to change the economic growth into investment? Because even if you have growth, it's not about how much you have, but what do you do with it? Thank you very much.
My name is Samuel Kenneth. I run a construction company. We build affordable housing in schools across Namibia. Extremely insightful, mind-blowing. I don't want to double dip, but I think one of the things that was refreshing was the cost-benefit analysis. What do you recommend to the average Joe to create more accountability and transparency over government decisions? Like, how do we get involved?
Let me go backwards, okay, on the cost-benefit analysis and how can people get involved, if I understood you correctly. I mean, decision makers in government need good information and they need good contacts with the rest of the economy, not just a small part of the economy, but the whole economy. And in some areas, Namibia does already have that. I have worked with the Chamber of Mines and engaged with government on that, and I think through that engagement, both sides have understood each other better and information has flowed. And I think that's still a Namibian strength, that ministers are open, their doors are often open, you can go and talk to them, you can argue your case. So I think we can build on that. But I do think we need a better defined cadre, if you like. I know that word is a little bit loaded, but a better defined cadre of technical economists in government. I suppose I would say this, but who can do analysis, who can crunch numbers, and who can work out consequences of particular actions, drawing in international experience as well. I don't get the sense a lot of that is going on. If any research is done by government, it's sort of farmed out to consultants. I'm not sure what generally happens to those reports. And they're often funded by donors. No one really cares an awful lot. You know, the consultant gets paid, the donor ticks the box that money's spent. But does government really want it? Does it really make an impact? I don't know. I think a lot of the time not. So I think we need to create that across government, and there are all sorts of interesting models for that. But these must be people, analysts, hard-nosed analysts, who can say to ministers the true findings of what their research and analysis has found. The minister, of course, can ignore that. The minister can always do that. But that needs to be part of the process of making decisions. There needs to be some awkward customers like me, if you like, in government saying, yes, but minister, what about this? What about that? You know, have you thought of the other kind of thing? We need that. And I think that's a healthy sign, even if they then get ignored. So that would be my response to you. The second to last question about, what about the middle? Yeah, I mean, I split this into two very polar opposites, if you like. Nothing's like that in any country. It's a sort of spectrum. Where do you find yourself on the spectrum? But I definitely feel we need to move from one part of the spectrum towards the other to a much greater degree. But I think that depends a lot on personalities. It depends a lot on leadership. This just doesn't happen. And the leadership has got to want that, and it's got to believe that that has value. And if that happens, then the sky's the limit. I think we can really go very, very far. But my sense is that political leaders in Namibia are still very sceptical of the value of this sort of more technocratic approach to things. Everything's politics. And I do understand that, but I think that has to change. The third to last question about the skewed economy and the 1.6 million people in poverty. I mean, that's the issue, isn't it? That is the issue. I don't have all the answers, but I would say we have a cash grant system that can be improved, but that is a sticking plaster. That is not an ultimate solution. The ultimate solution involves creating more jobs for people, formal or informal, but especially formal or especially better paid jobs. And that involves getting people into higher productivity activities. And that can be as a result of local investment or international investment, or a combination of the two. But that is what we have to do. And that is what that increasing urban population will have to do. And the question is, how do we encourage the investment? Because to get that, you need investment. How do we encourage the investment to achieve that? I don't, I'm not talking rocket science here. These are almost obvious things. So we need to very much focus on new business growth. And I don't think we put nearly enough attention to that issue. I mean, we don't even have statistics really on new businesses in Namibia, but we must encourage the entrepreneurial talents of all Namibians in all parts of the country to set up businesses and make it as easy as possible for them to do so. But that mustn't become a balancing act there. It mustn't become a social welfare program. They must become real business people who can develop their businesses over time and perhaps eventually take their businesses into the export market. That's not an easy trick to pull off, but I think we don't put enough attention on that. We don't put enough attention on small business growth and new business. mean, I mentioned the SME Bank earlier. And then globalization and democratization, yes. I mean, these are very big questions, and I think they have all the answers. What are the benefits to locals? Well, I don't make myself popular when I say this, but I say bringing in foreign multinational companies is often a very good thing. These guys have capital, these guys have skills, and if they're pressurized or if they're encouraged to share all this with Namibians, I think you can see the most fantastic results. I mean, you know, I have one example here right in front of me, B2 Gold. This is sort of a Canadian listed company. It's come here, it's developed a mine, it developed it at a very good time, it's making lots of money, it's paying lots of tax, it's employing lots of Namibians, and it's doing a whole range of incredible things across the economy. And this is a foreign company, including sponsoring my book, to say. So I don't think we mustn't have this sort of knee-jerk reaction to foreign companies. Yes, there are cowboys as well. I'm not going to name them here today. But our investment system must encourage the good ones and discourage the bad ones. My concern is, with this sort of murky investment environment that we're creating, we're actually discouraging the good ones from coming and encouraging the cowboys and the sharks to come and do business here, if you see what I mean. And that is, in my view, a great shame. Exactly where the balance is between local benefits and foreign shareholders sort of basically shafting us, that is a very good question. I think we need a lot more debate about that. I've made a number of proposals in the past in terms of how we can achieve a better balance. Obviously, the procurement of these companies, the employment of these companies, the skills, and also to make that more public. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with the Chamber of Mines of Namibia here, developing a much more informative annual review, which the Chamber still publishes, which shows what companies are doing in Namibia for Namibians. And I think we need a lot more than that. All I would say is, I know, you know, people with a certain political point of view see globalization as extremely problematic. I don't. I see it as a huge opportunity for a small country to find its place in the global marketplace and use the economies of scale there to really ramp up production of goods and services. The question is, which goods, which services, what can we produce competitively to sell to the rest of the world? If we get that right, then the sky's the limit, because we're a small country. We only really have to find 500,000 jobs and we're home and dry. And I think we can do that, but it's that process of finding our place in this big market before that market then splits up and different parts of the world go their separate way. So I don't have all the answers, I admit, but those are some preliminary thoughts, and I'm very happy to hear your comments back on them. Graham.
Good evening.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Agustin Stanyanga. I just wanted to ask what we talked about when we do not properly assess public infrastructures. Okay, I believe when government takes this, when they take this decision to do what they are doing, they know that, okay, this is the benefit that the public is going to have. And I believe there are economists that advise them in doing this kind of things. I just wanted to find out if there is anything in their view, perhaps, that, okay, for you, if you are an economist, you did your research, perhaps in their point of view, there is some benefit that they still see, in which you think it's failing, but to them maybe it's not failing, it's going forward. So maybe you can hear from them if there is anybody that can give us that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Franz. I'm here.
Sorry, Franz, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I really enjoyed your presentation. But maybe the question something that I thought maybe you have doesn't really feature in your presentation, since you have also evoked this idea of cost-benefit analysis. I was just wondering if economic empowerment, it plays a role, and if somebody like you you don't reconcile that view in your thinking. I don't really quite get it. 2011, when we conducted the census, this is for me really the reality on the ground. I was deployed in Omatabo constituency during the enumeration. This is where, for the first time, and even if I'm talking, the question of land ownership for me, it becomes so real, because I've seen, especially those, we have to call the office, and the office to call people outside to open the gate. The land ownership, land absentees. So it's really the question of how do you reconcile that dynamic within the question of land and economic empowerment. Because if you don't feature that, I will have a problem to appreciate your thinking as an offer to the whole and entirety of economic prescription. So I think it's maybe the other aspect is also the question of credibility of political leadership.
We've got your point.
Oh.
It's very, very important about that.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Thanks.
we can move on to
In Europe, we are witnessing an energy crisis caused by the war in Ukraine. Some analysts are expecting this energy crisis to lead to some economic crisis or some economic problems in Europe. I just want to know, what do you think, what type of impact will such a crisis cause on a small open economy such as Namibia, generally, but more specifically on our financial markets, financial stability of the country? How will that impact on our savings, for example, or let me say the value of our currency? What are the linkages that are there in the financial markets, the global financial markets, and how will such a crisis impact us?
But I want to come back to the matter of policy. And I want to say that, and I say this in great humility, that in 2015, I made a private submission to the current incumbent in the presidency, saying, and the paper was called "A Case for Policy Advice and Science and Research in Informing Policy." Needless to say, I didn't get as much as a recognition of that paper. Maybe it was a poor paper. But the matter of policy is very central, because I believe being pragmatic in policy and looking at it a little bit more philosophically, policy is not just a domain for experts or for technocrats. With great respect, that's not what you said, but it's not just the world of the technocrat. Because policy really revolves around a number of key questions. We have to be utterly honest with ourselves. The first question is, what are the primary ideas, or if you want, the ideology that informs our policy? What are the ideologies or the ideas, the construct of ideas that we need to have to build policy for our context? Secondly, we need to ask the question of interests. In whose interests are we developing the policy? The fundamental question. We often don't ask those questions. We need to ask the institutions question. What institutions do we require to be able to execute policy, to develop the policy, to monitor, to implement, and do all those other things? We need to ask the information question, your question, when we need to have the policy. Then we need to ask the impact questions. What are the impacts the policy would likely have if they were to work and if they were not to work? So there's a pretty standard, fundamental 5 or 6I approach, but we don't do that. I have a reasonable experience in policy design at high level, complex policies, multi-level policies, transnational policies. And when you approach policy from this perspective, people look at you as if you're from another planet. Because policy is what has been done prior to what you design now. They say, well, we've always done it this way. We repeat the budget, we repeat the policy, we talk about the policy cycle and so on. But if we were just to do these fundamental basic things, all of us will make headway and will move ahead. So I
John Corbett, freelance journalist. Andre kind of covered the thing I really wanted to ask, but let me ask you a bit of a loaded question. Given the past 30 years track record, how do you rank the percentage-wise the high road, the possibility, the likelihood of maybe taking the high road or the low road in terms of your final scenario, i.e. sustained growth, the high road, or increase indebtedness to the rest of the world, low road?
I think the outcome, given I've studied the last 30 years quite carefully, I think the outcome is going to be somewhere between the two, possibly mixed, a sort of a mixture of both. But I think, I'd say an awful lot depends on the personality and the conviction of the next president in this country from 2025. I think personalities make a difference everywhere, but especially in a country like Namibia. And I don't have a crystal ball to say which personality is going to be the next president of this country. So I think that's very important. I personally, a lot of what government has started to put in place as far as oil is concerned, I find very encouraging. When I hear Tom Alwenda talk about oil, and when I see sovereign wealth fund being established with this sort of policy framework around it, I listen to politicians and technocrats, I'm quite encouraged, I have to say. But I think it's all to play for, and I think civil society plays a role in all this as well. So organisations like IPPR, and people like yourselves in the room, applying pressure to make sure government, whichever colour is edged, is nudged in the right direction on this. I think the free press plays a role, civil society, people like yourself, John, all that plays a role in helping to keep government on the straight and narrow. So I'm fundamentally optimistic, I have to say. I'm fundamentally optimistic about Namibia. I don't think we need a 180-degree, we're not yet too far gone. We don't need a 180-degree turnabout, but we need to do certain things better. We're going to create winners and losers, inevitably, but we have to take the tough decisions, I'm afraid, sometimes. So I think somewhere in the middle, slightly veering towards the higher road rather than the low road. I don't see us becoming another sort of Gabon or Nigeria with our oil resources. I remain an optimist. Andre, I'm not sure if that was a question. I think I agree with everything you said. There's a lot in there. We could have a much longer discussion. So I'm going to just say yes. I go along with that. So I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's okay. The question of Europe and what's happening there and the spillover effects it will have on us. I mean, that's a very big question. But I've no doubt movements in interest rates in other parts of the world affect us very, very quickly. We will have to raise interest rates as well. The more debt you sell to the world, the more important that is. And we have, all sorts of debt to all sorts of people. So I think there is a transmission mechanism, primarily through interest rates, but also through other mechanisms as well. There'll be a slowdown in growth, things we've been through before. I think that's where good policy helps you combat the high seas that I was talking about earlier. I'm not sure that's a terribly convincing answer, but we will be affected. We are affected by what goes on in the rest of the world because of things over which we have no control. That will not change. It won't change. The question of land, I deliberately avoided the question of land, possibly for obvious reasons. This is a very, very important issue and a very sensitive issue. And I think I see it first and foremost as a political issue. I think economists can make a useful contribution towards this, but it's not just about economics. Let me say a couple of things about land. There's a chapter in the book about land reform. Let me say a couple of things from an economic perspective. The first is, I think since independence we've seen the price of commercial land rise very substantially. And that's because people want land. And you know, the old white community here, the new black elite, all want land, everyone wants land. They want land because they want land, not necessarily to make a thriving business out of it. But this demand pushes up the price of land far beyond the land's capacity to generate a financial return over and above what it costs to buy the land. You know, it's like if I buy a house at a very high price and I try and rent it out, and the rental market is very low, and I'm not going to recover the money I've borrowed to pay for that house. So there are a lot of dynamics, market dynamics within the land market that policy has encouraged, I think, and that can be damaging because basically government then has to go into the market and pay higher prices for land that it then redistributes through a land reform program. You know, if you look at my calculations, I don't know if they're contained in the book, but I've written papers about this. You know, what is given that we go in, government buys the land, given that that is sort of an anchored policy, and we can discuss whether it should be, but given that that is the case, how much is it worth government spending to resettle one family onto a piece of land? If it's $100,000, is it worth it? Is it $500,000? Is it worth it? Is it $1 million? Is it worth it? Is it not better to provide other things for that $1 million? There's always an opportunity cost for these things. You could possibly pay for someone to go to the best university in the United States for the same price that it costs to resettle someone onto a very expensive piece of Namibian commercial land. I know that isn't a very popular message, but economists always look at opportunity cost. I think, you know, these are questions we have to discuss. I think that's sort of what I wanted to say about land. There is a lot more we could say. As I said already, the Namibian population is becoming now majority urban. If we had a census, I'm sure that would bear it out, because the trends are all in that direction. And so it's possible that land is becoming a less important issue in terms of pure numbers of people affected by it. I'm putting this out there as a point for discussion. First question then was public infrastructure and cost-benefit analysis. Doesn't this already take place? It's quite possible it does. I've seen no evidence of it. I've never seen a sort of proper business case of cost-benefit analysis for a significant piece of public infrastructure. It's possible it's there somewhere in the National Planning Commission on someone's desk, but it's certainly not made public. And looking at the outcome of that, of what actually happens to government's public investment program, I'd be very surprised if proper cost-benefit analysis had been conducted, I have to say. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say on public infrastructure at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I used to be in.
So that even adds to the idea that there's no cost-benefit analysis. There's nothing at all. I mean, it's hard to believe how it actually happened, but definitely 230 million, I think, was spent. But quite how it happened, and now I think the NSPAP is not seen as something that necessarily should stand on its own and might be going back into the ministry. So, yeah, just to underline that point. I think we'll have a final round of questions just now. I realise it's getting a little bit late. Some people have started to leave. Please, if you can, put out the feedback form that's been handed around, and just either leave them on the chairs or give them to one of the HSF or IPPR staff that are around. So
Namibia has been ranked as a middle income country for the past years. I can't remember for how long. But it's a good thing, also depending on how you look at it. So my question is more on when we look at this middle country income ranking. It has also become challenging for us in the international development space when we have to secure funds. Okay. So from an economist perspective, what would your advice be when it comes to funding modalities, fiscal modalities, for us to secure donor funds, because we equally contribute to the development of Namibia, not directly, but more from an indirect perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead. Oh, yes, good evening. My name is Julian David. I'm here in my personal capacity. Robin, and Colise, Your book is titled A Guide to the Namibian Economy. And from your presentation, I've understood that you have been writing this book in series, this is the fifth edition. So how has it been helpful to the government, to society, or can you just lay down some key contributions, how it has helped the government and society, or this new book is just going to be another book? So can you just say how did it help the government?
Yes, thank you. My name is Thomas. I'm a cotton farmer. So I just wanted to ask, because I wanted to talk about two key things, about the technocrats and what the difference between ethics and policy, which one comes first. Because I feel offended, so to say, because since like we got independence, it never actually published a vacancy of saying, no, we are looking for a philosopher of ethics, but yet we use those words daily. But if you try to understand the ideology of ethics and policy, then maybe also you can relate it to me in this question as an economist. How do you understand ethics in the perspective of maintaining and managing policy? And also, I just want to understand now, like moving forward, as you said, who will be the next president, and because now it's the presidency. So when you say the presidency, we are all involved. You cannot only blame the president of wrong execution or corruption drinks or everything. But now, as an economics for this book now, how do you address those kind of pigments at the pragmatic level? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe one last point.
I'll take it if My name is Benjuja Black. If you can, Mr. Shebourne, maybe you could speak to the issue of education and the long-term economic implications thereof. And I'm raising this point because I want to take advantage of the fact that there are members of parliament here and leaders of political parties, and I think it's something that we're not looking at closely. Because the gentleman to the right spoke about not just making Namibia great, but creating great Namibians. It's not necessary, to my view, it's not really sustainable to rely heavily on our natural resources and the hope of a leader who will be accountable and embrace technocrats if we don't also look at making the Namibians great. Because one of the very, very small percentage of our population that's formally employed, very few of us are even earning taxable incomes. And because of that, and because of the inequality, we are barely accessing education, very few people, or quality education. And then maybe it also goes to the issue, because in your book, one of the highlights was that we consistently spend a great amount of our income and revenue on education, but what are the cost benefit analysis that we've seen on that? Because the idea is that in terms of foreign direct investment, it looks as if we are setting ourselves up or selling ourselves as a country that's going to provide cheap labor for the rest of the world. Is that how we're going to play on the global stage? Education. And
true, there are some NGOs campaigning against this. I think government has made the decision. I think international companies will come in and help exploit those resources. I don't think that's an issue. And there might be European companies like Shell or Total, or there might be Chevron from the US or Chinese companies or whatever. So there will always be protesters. I mean, any element of development involves damaging something to gain something else. I'm afraid that's, we're not leaving the earth as a pristine earth because of industrial development. So if you're going to develop, you're going to damage something, but you have to, as a country, decide what you are prepared to damage and what you're not prepared to damage. And again, economists do a lot of calculations and coming back to cost-benefit analysis on these sorts of things, taking into account environmental damage as well. So I don't think European NGOs are in any way going to stop Namibia from exploiting its oil resources if that's what it decides to do, and it seems it has decided to do that. I think, there is the argument that Namibia could make this leap forward, going back to my great leap forward, and just sort of miss this whole fossil fuel driven economic development. So we don't have to follow the same path as other parts of the world, the Europeans, the Chinese or whatever. because we've got abundant renewable resources. And one of the promises held out by companies like Hyphen is that they can over-engineer the renewable parts of their operations, the wind power, the solar power, and feed that into Namibia's grid and power Namibia using those resources. Now, I know there are all sorts of issues about reliability and baseload and stuff like that, but that is another way of looking at it. We don't have to go, yes, they did this, and they're still possibly doing it, but we don't have to do that if it's to our advantage not to do that. I think these are sovereign decisions that we have to make, and I don't think there's any problem at all in Namibia doing that, to be perfectly frank. Education. Okay, you put me on the spot with education, I'm afraid. There is no chapter in my book on education, I am ashamed to say. It is such an important issue. It's one that I'd love to have a look at. I know, Justin, we have experts in education in the audience. I think if I say anything about it, I'm going to make a fool of myself. And perhaps the next edition, if there is one, will have a chapter on education, skills and training, because it is a subject that I'm absolutely passionate about. I know it's important. I would say, again, bringing my technocrat's hat back, putting it back on. We have an education system. As a proportion of the budget, we're spending an awful lot of money on it, but are we getting good value for that expenditure? Where is the money going? Are the people actually learning something, or they're just sitting in the classroom? I would love to do a whole analysis of Namibia's education sector and possibly come to some hard and fast conclusions. So I'm not going to say much, but I do think we can spend money much more wisely, public money. I mean, we threw $10 billion at Air Namibia over a period of 20 years. Now, there's always an opportunity cost for this money. You're saving Air Namibia for 20 years, but you could spend the $10 billion on something else. I mean, a friend of mine in Botswana, his daughter has just gone to UCLA to study microbiology, and the government of Botswana pays a full scholarship for that. Possibly that's what we need here. It comes back to my land question, my rather unpopular answer. If it costs $1 million to resettle a family, maybe better to send them off to the States to get a really good degree or something, or China, or wherever you want to send them, and they come back as a productive person. I think there is a concern. This is a broader concern as to whether we're creating an economy with only high-skilled jobs available. If you look at the people in the formal sector economy in Namibia, it's possibly, and I'd like to do more research on this, but it's possibly only those very high-skilled, and we're leaving out the more unskilled people, because we're not building factories where lots of unskilled people can work, or farms where lots of unskilled people can work, and that's a definite concern. A gentleman here said, well, are we just not opening ourselves up as a pool of unskilled labour to the global markets? Well, my view is, in a way, we need to do that more. We need to get people on the employment ladder at the bottom, but then gradually take them up over time, rather than just leave them there with nothing at all, which is essentially what we've been doing at the moment. So, economics is about difficult decisions. It's about doing unpopular things a lot of the time, but that is my view. Going back, I'm not sure I got the question, but ethics is obviously very important. The national interest is important. Economists and technocrats must answer to democratically elected politicians, but democratically elected politicians at the same time must listen to technical arguments. They must be open to that, and they must be able to change their minds or make their decisions on the basis of that. Otherwise, we're just throwing darts at a dartboard blindfolded, I'm afraid, and that is what we do a lot of the time. On middle-income country status and donor funds, I'm going to say something very unpopular again. Yes, this middle-income status has been bugging us in Namibia since I was working in the Planning Commission in the early 90s. I frankly don't think the future of this country is in the hands of foreign donors. They can, at the margin, make a bit of a difference, but it's up to us to marshal our resources properly and allocate them effectively, develop good policy, and implement effectively. Donors are very, very small parts of the picture in Namibia, and I think that's a very good thing, but it means there's additional responsibility on us to get things right, and that's sort of what I'm arguing in this presentation. Thank you very much.